Clauses. Let's talk a little bit more about clauses. Clauses are constituent of other sentences. For example, we know that every sentence consists of at least one clause. For example, he's a teacher, so it's a sentence. It starts with a capital letter and ends with a period. It consists of one clause, so we may call it one clause sentence. So clauses are the constituent of other sentences or of phrases. Sometimes we may have a clause within a phrase. Generally, a noun phrase may have an adjective clause in it, right? Or so a constituent sentence or clause may be coordinated with one or more other constituent sentence to form a compound sentence, or it may be embedded in another sentence or in a phrase to form a complex sentence. So we have seen that a compound sentence may have two or more than two independent clauses, or a clause may be a constituent of a sentence, like it may be the subject or object, or it may be the adverbial clause, right? So they can be of different types, or sometimes a clause can be within a noun phrase. So they are called embedded clauses. In simple sentences, the boundaries of the sentence and clause coincide. For example, he's a teacher, it's a sentence, but as well as it's a clause. A simple sentence is one clause sentence, whereas compound and complex sentence always contain at least two clauses. So if we look at these compound sentences, so we can say that one evening he asked whether he go home with her. So in this sentence we can see that one evening he asked is one clause, and there is an embedded clause whether he might go home with her. Similarly, his aunt feared that he might catch something. His aunt feared is one clause, and that he might catch something is an embedded clause, and this is joined by and but with the first clause A. Similarly, the C clause, his uncle said that evil communication corrupted good manner. So this is joined by and it has an embedded clause, that evil communication corrupted good manner. So these are different clauses, independent clauses joined by a coordinator, and they have embedded clauses, right? So for example, if we take the B clause, his aunt feared that he might catch something. That he might catch something was feared by his aunt. So we can use that clause, which is an embedded clause, a constituent of the main clause, his aunt feared, can be made a passive sentence as well, to see whether it is a constituent or not. So passivization affect the string and tell that the string is a sentence constituent. The same is confirmed by pseudo-clefting and by pronominalization or use of it, etc. What his aunt feared was that he might catch something, so it's pseudo communication. What did his aunt fear, etc. Right? Bracketing of this constituent provisionally gives us the following result: main sentence, his aunt feared, and subordinate sentence, that he might catch something. It is clear that the string he might catch something is also an S, but what about the element that, right? Sentence 6 is to be bracketed as his aunt feared, that is an X. Sentence 2, he might catch something. So we have labeled that as X. So however, passivization, pseudo-clefting and nominalization affect the constituent labeled X in 7, not just sentence, right? The role of that in 7 is that of linking sentence to the embedded sentence. His aunt feared that, right? So that is the embedded sentence of fear to the sentence inside which it occurs, that is the subordinator. The constituent X comprising the subordinator and S2 is often labeled as S bar or prime S. So we should know that it is a subordinator, right? So we have named it S bar. S is written with the bar, small bar over it, or it is called S prime. It is a unit containing the subordinator and the subordinate. So you can see S bar, that into sentence, consists of sentence. So the element that occupies the so-called complementizer slot, complement slot is the front of the sentence as to our bracketing of 1b may be adapted as to his aunt fear. This is sentence 1. Then we have that as S bar, and sentence 2, he might catch something. So let us try to analyze the third conjoint in 1c above, repeated here as 10. His uncle said that evil communication corrupted good manner. Following the procedure we have used above, we can essentially have the same structure, right? His aunt feared he might catch something. His uncle said evil communication corrupted good manner. In the passive variant of these sentences, that is not deletable. If we make the passive sentence of these, we cannot delete that. However, generally it can be deleted, and in grammatical language we say it's here it is a 0. That he said he would come, instead of he said that he would come, we say he said he would come, and we consider that as employed, and or we have a term 0 that for it. But when this is put into the passive, this element, this constituent, the embedded element is put into passivization, so that goes with it. That is, in that case, is not possible to be dropped. Similarly, if we say without, this is what I've been saying, if he might catch without using that element, this will be an incorrect sentence. So let's now finally consider the structure of the first conjoint in L1a above, repeated as 13. One evening he asked whether he might go home with her. If you apply some of the tests described above, test, pseudo clefting, pronominalization, passivization, etc., you'll find that whether he might go home with her is a constituent. For example, pseudo clefting, what he asked one evening was whether he might go home with her. So this tells us that whether he might go home a constituent. What did he ask? So if we put up a question, what did he ask one evening? Whether he might go with her, right? So we know that it's a constituent. So this string, whether he might go home with her, is an embedded yes/no question. So when yes no questions are embedded, the subordinator is whether or if, not that. That's very important to be remember, that when there is a yes no question is embedded, right, the subordinator will always be whether or if, not that, right? The sentence 13 may be bracketed as follows. One evening he asked whether, if, not that, he might go home with her. Complementizer slot can be filled by whether or if, but not with that. Repeatedly I say. Notice that whether and if cannot be deleted, unlike that. I've said that that can be omitted, but from this sentence, as we can omit that from he said he would come, we cannot say he said he might go. He asked he might go, because we need to bring whether or if. That's important. WH question, why did you measure the distance? What did you see there? Right? Such question may also be embedded in other sentences, but we need no special subordinator to do that, because WH question are used as subordinator themselves, so we do not use them. So the Kroner asks S bar, why the witness had measured the distance. So you can see that we don't need any subordinator like that, if or whether in these questions. So now also compare 21 and 22 and below in more acceptable American English than it is in standard British English. The new law requires that seat belt should be worn by all passengers. Similarly, the new law requires for seat belts to be worn by all passengers. So we know that that seat belt should be worn as a constituent. It can be replaced with for seat belt to be worn by the passenger. 21 and 22 have the same meaning and the same structure. We may passive voice them. That seat belt should be worn by the passenger is required by the new law. For seat belts to be worn by all passengers is required by the new law. So we can have pseudo clefting as well. What the new law requires is that seat belt should be worn by all passengers. So what the new law requires is for seat belt to be worn by all passengers. What conclusion can we draw with respect to the constituent of these sentences? It seems that 21 requires the following partial bracketing. S1, the new law requires, then we have as S bar, that, and then we have sentence 2, seat belt should be worn. So this will be the bracketing of the sentence. So the string for seat belt to be worn by all passenger in 22, as we have seen, structurally resemble the S bar, that seat belt should be worn by all passenger. We shall assume by analogy with 27 for all also occupies the complement slot, and the seat belts to be worn by all passenger is an embedded sentence. The analysis then follows as 22. Note that 21 allows a great deal of variation in front of be worn. We can use should be worn, must be worn, etc. We could replace should by must or shall, and should be worn by or are worn. In fact, should, must and shall may also be absent. They can be, we can simply say be worn. The new law requires that seat belt be worn. Instead of should be worn, we can simply say be worn. So the sequence to be worn is called an infinitive of the verb wear. If we replace seat belt by a pronoun, we find another contrast. The new law requires that they should be worn. The new law requires for them to be worn. However, in the first place we use they, and in the first sentence 30 we use they, and in the 31 we must use them. So non-infinitive clauses may also contain a bare infinitive. Bare infinitive of verbs first form without to, or they may contain an ing participle or an ed participle. If we look at we saw Mary leave, so we have bare infinitive leave. We saw Mary leaving, we have participle as leaving as participle. I do not mind Mary's leaving. So here leaving can be a gerund clause. We found all these seats occupied. So we have a participle which is ed, right? So these are all types of clauses. These are embedded clauses. The first, leave is a non-finite clause. Leaving is a non-finite clause. Similarly, Mary's leaving is a non-finite clause, and occupied, seats occupied is a non-finite clause. So these are different types of clauses. So sometimes we have a clause which has a subject, object, or all the constituents. Sometimes it's simply basis on the verb, and there can also be a verbless clause. So English has verbless clauses, for example, usually a form of to be, and sometime other elements have been deleted. John believes the prisoner innocent. So the prisoner innocent, actually in this sentence the italicized the prisoner innocent is a verbless clause, which assume is a reduced version of the to infinitive clause. John believes the prisoner to be innocent. Remember that in every sentence in which we have a verb, we that has the potential to be a clause. So we call it a clause. The following sentence contain further examples. He considered the girl a good student. So the girl a good student is a verbless clause. Whenever in trouble, Bill rang his girlfriend. So whenever is in trouble is a verbless clause. He married her when a student at Harvard. So when a student at Harvard, all this is a verbless clause. So we have gone through different types of verbless, different types of clauses, dependent clauses, independent clauses, and infinitive clauses, and non-infinitive clauses, and also verbless clauses.